Hello and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Chinese President Xi Jinping met face-to-face for the first time at the G20 Summit. It signaled a potential thaw in a diplomacy that has been frosty for several years, which took a sharp downturn in 2020 when Beijing imposed sanctions on Australian goods. Political rhetoric and trade disputes led to suspension in talks between both nations. What will the relationship look like going forward with an Albanese-led government? Will the new Australian Prime Minister continue his predecessor's aggressive stance toward China? Joining me to discuss this topic is Professor Richard Cullen from the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Professor, thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
Azam, thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here.
Both leaders met face-to-face for the first time at the G20 Summit, and they said the tone was cordial, but there was no major breakthroughs. So I just want to get your initial thoughts on what happened.
Okay, well, thank you. The meeting actually prompted recollections. I'm old enough to have actually voted in the election which elected Gough Whitlam and the ALP government in 1972, and they recognised Beijing as the representative government of China within about a week of that election in December 1972. That was a very dramatic thing to do. By January of the following year, they pulled out of Vietnam, out of the Vietnam War. Both these things were done without the approval of Washington. That wasn't sought in advance, and normally that might have been done, but Whitlam was exercising, independent sovereignty of Australia, you might say. Subsequently, in 1975, his government was dismissed by the Governor-General. John Pilger, the leading journalist, controversially, but I think cogently argued that there was some CIA involvement in that dismissal. You can look this up easily enough using Google and see if you agree with him. In any event, the Prime Minister who took over, Malcolm Fraser, took over very controversially, subsequently wrote a book in 2014. Both Whitlam and Fraser are now dead, I should add. But Fraser wrote in 2014, the book was called Dangerous Allies. And in this book, amongst other things, he said unequivocally that America was a dangerous ally because of the influence and control they applied in Australia. So these were, the meeting really took me back to reflecting on what had happened in the past and then wondering what's going to happen as we go forward.
Right, and that's a very interesting historical backdrop. But now would you say that the United States and the Australian and Chinese relationship is dependent on how the Chinese and the United States relationship goes?
Well, that's going to have a big influence on it for sure.
Right.
But the point that Whitlam and indeed his Fraser, who was from the opposite side of politics, made, that Australia should be making up its own mind about that direction. It's more difficult now. There's no question. Look, the bottom line is the problem is the difference between then, even 20 years or 10 years ago, the difference is the success of China. It's just been too successful.
Right.
So it presents a much greater cause of concern, a threat indeed, many American commentators seem to think, to American control of the rules-based international order, as they like to call it, referred to probably more accurately as hegemony by other commentators.
Right, and the Sino-Australian relationship took a particularly sharp turn downward when the Chinese imposed sanctions on a bunch of Australian goods. But it was a growing list for China. They felt that they've been attacked from their perspective from Australia, who had taken a hard stance, whether it was the AUKUS deal or political rhetoric that was coming from their side. So how did the relationship reach that down point?
Yeah, well, another good question. Again, if you'll permit me a little bit more of a quick trip back in history, it's worth noting that the OECD is on record as saying how Australia has achieved the longest period of sustained economic growth in the whole history of the OECD. up until 2020, when there was a relatively mild recession as a result of COVID. But 28 years, in fact, of uninterrupted growth. And that 28 years of uninterrupted growth in Australia is fundamentally underpinned by the relationship, the trading relationship with China. I mean, put it as simply as possible, what's good for China has been very good for Australia. Probably the only other two places that have done quite so well might be Hong Kong and Taiwan. So that background sits there as Australia begins to take a more aggressive attitude to China, as you say, starting several years ago, really dating back to when Huawei looked like it was going to be involved in the 5G network in Australia. The change, I think, really, there were changes in Australia, but the change of mood in the US, especially as President Trump came to power, has been fundamental in shaping what's happened in Australia, because it's very much shaped how the media have dealt with it, the US-led world media. And so that pattern, that American pattern of increasing and intense discomfort with the rise of China has only grown worse under President Biden, in my view, from what I can see. You know, the rhetoric's a bit different. Biden doesn't have the same mannerisms and style as Trump, but the substance is pretty much the same. It's very.
Do you think that's going to be the case as well with Albanese being a continuity of Morrison, who also took quite a, I don't want to say war hawk kind of style, but a very aggressive style towards China. So do you think Albanese's government will be a similar continuity that Biden was to Trump?
There'll be a change, and there already is a change, I think. The approach of the Albanese government is certainly, look, they put the megaphone away to start off with. I mean, they're not out there trying to aggravate and pick quarrels. On the contrary, the new foreign minister, I think, is very adept and capable and intelligent, and is clearly looking to build a better relationship with China, clearly understands how important it is in all of its dimensions, including ones which are concerning, but also all of the positive dimensions. The Minister of Defence in Australia has shown a liking for the sort of military posturing that has become so common now, and indeed, he's waved through this plan to base B-52 bombers in Darwin or near Darwin. But I think he too, both of these ministers indeed have been engaged in dialogue with their counterparts in the mainland, in China. And this is a significant breakthrough in itself. At least if you're talking, you can express your disagreements without needing the megaphone, without needing to stir up trouble and pick quarrels and, tell people what's going on the front page of The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald.
Yeah, I think Albanese has also dealt a certain cards that he's sort of forced in a corner where he has to deal with the AUKUS. That AUKUS deal has come through, a certain Indo-Pacific stance. So he just sort of has to, do you think he has to navigate that or find the balancing act of trying to reestablish economic relationship with China, but also continue with these cards that he was dealt with?
Yeah, he does. I mean, that's the reality. And there's a long history of the Labor Party being, like the Conservatives in Australia, concerned about, worried about, and drawn to the US alliance. And these things have been put in place, and the Labor Party have enthusiastically endorsed AUKUS for political reasons, but I guess they believe in it as well. I mean, the commentary is clear. It's going to cost a fortune. It will most certainly go up, and we're likely to wait until, till 2040 or even 50 before we get the submarines. The B-52s are a bigger problem, but the Americans obviously want this, and Australia has agreed to that. China must be watching. They'll not be happy about this, but they're good at tolerating and keeping on talking. And the change that's happened is at least Australia's moving away from aggressive rhetoric and so on directed at China.
Right. There's also virtually every poll in Australia has seen a spike in a sort of viewing of China as a threat now. Perhaps that was parallel to Morrison's stance and just different things that happened in Hong Kong with regards to the protests and everything. Where do you think that came from? And do you think that's likely to also dictate Albanese's stance towards China?
That I think less so, definitely less so in the case of this government.
Right.
Look, the background again to this does go back to the 19th century and the concern about the so-called yellow peril. So there's Australia is a tolerant and a good place to live and work, but there is an underlying concern about what Asia and particularly China and its huge population, which goes back to that period. The previous government, I think, saw benefits from their aggressive stance, and even if they were, as they say in Australia, dog whistling, and okay to be anti-Chinese in a more general way, they didn't see that as a problem. But that clearly appears to have backfired at the last election, where it seems quite a lot of ethnic Chinese voters in Australia shifted their votes away from the Morrison government towards the ALP. And so that I think the current government will be steering away from that particular approach.
Right. Professor Cullen, I'm going to have to pause you there for a quick moment while we take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Professor Cullen from HKU. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk the Walk. I'm speaking with HKU Professor Richard Cullen on the outlook of Sino-Australian diplomacy. Professor, would you say that Australia's core China policy will remain hardline? And what are the off-ramps that you could envision for Albanese as he tries to reestablish trade relations or going back to the initial trade relations that they had with China?
Well, I think the current difficulty, the tension increased tension between Australia and China in terms of relations, it's not going to go away quickly. But I don't see it getting worse. And I do see these meetings which have taken place as being a positive sign. And I think China is very clever in dealing with this. They've got a very good ambassador in Australia now, who's working to try and make the relationship more smooth. And so I think we've got to pause in things getting worse. Off-ramps, the dialogue itself obviously is important, and I think the message being sent that we want to discuss these issues, including trade issues, is good, and whether there will be any particular signs either from China or Australia, we'll have to wait and see. But I wouldn't be surprised to see some gradual progress being made in resolving some particular aspects of the disputation.
Right, and I think the Indo-Pacific will obviously play an important role in that dynamic between both of them geopolitically. And Canada unveiled a recent Indo-Pacific strategy plan to about $1.5 billion on military spending, cybersecurity in the Indo-Pacific region aimed at China. When you combine that with Prime Minister Sunak's recent rhetoric in his first foreign policy speech, which focused a lot on China and the need to challenge China, what are your thoughts on these developments playing out?
Well, as far as Canada is concerned, I've got the headline, the little headline here. I can't do better than Alex Lowe's comment in the South China Morning Post recently. I think it's right on the money. The headline says, faithful Canada to join US against China. And it then says, even without a personal stake in the Asia-Pacific, Ottawa will still follow the leader in Washington's campaign to contain China. That seems to be what's going on. And Sunak, well, you know, he's now, his most recent speech as a prime minister dealing with foreign policy is certainly toned down, less hostile than the aggressiveness of some of his previous recent comments on China. He's also, though, got to deal with a very well-organised and really quite hostile to China lobby, a significant one within the Tory or Conservative Party. So these people are, you know, they're committed, anyhow, significantly, I think, to supporting the US line wherever that goes. If it goes too far, perhaps they will say something. But let me just add, you know, finally here, there's somebody that everybody we've talked about could learn a lot from, I think, or a country, a jurisdiction, and that's Australia and Canada and the UK, and that's the other member of the Five Eyes, New Zealand. So now New Zealand are lucky, I guess, in that they are a small potato, as they say. I mean, they're nothing like as significant as Australia strategically in terms of resources and size and so on. But they've been able to maintain a genuinely independent sovereignty of, you know, close to the sort of thing that Whitlam and Fraser stressed was important for Australia, but which we don't adhere to now. But New Zealand have been able to maintain membership of the Five Eyes spying, frankly, alliance, and also relatively good relations with the US, but far better relationship with China, critical, but more respectful, and certainly much better engaged than the others. And I think there's a lesson there.
That's interesting. That's interesting you bring up New Zealand. That's an interesting comparison because they have taken a much more measured approach towards China and cautious about the Five Eyes and their containment towards China. So that's something that, do you think Australia could also perhaps mimic, or New Zealand can play an influence in their relationship?
Well, it shows you what's possible as this reset is going on. Things are not going to happen quickly. As I said, and putting the megaphone away, that can be done relatively quickly. But working out a better position, really a sort of basic position for Australia, and understanding what Australia's national interest is, New Zealand points a way towards what is possible and what we could be aiming for, quite frankly.
Right. You've co-written a great book with Christine Loh, which talks about Hong Kong's potential as a storyteller. So how can Hong Kong find a way to tell China's story to Australia or be part of that sort of mediation of soft power?
Well, thank you for that observation, and you know, great credit to Christine Loh, of course, when we worked on that book. Look, you touch on a really important point, which I hadn't thought of before in this way. And let me make that point, and then I'll make a more general one. The direct point is that Hong Kong, without question, although English is not the primary language, Hong Kong is still the leading English language-based city inside China. Okay, it's a secondary language, but it's very widely used, and particularly officially. So Hong Kong is in a position to help. I think you're right about that. And, you know, I do quite a bit of writing. Christine does. Many others as well are writing and trying to provide an explanation of the, you know, the sort you're talking about China and about Hong Kong. However, here's the difficulty. And we just have to realise this and keep working at it. Let me say, personally, I've basically given up trying to write for the mainstream media in Australia or the UK, for example. I mean, I've got a little pile of rejection slips, or I just never hear from these people again when I submit. And I guess, my approach is too not regarded as being certainly anti-China, but it's not what they want to publish and what they think their readers want. So the mainstream Western media, I mean, its power, its marketing power, frankly, its propaganda power, is simply immense. Here's an example. Jiang Zemin, of course, died very recently. I've been reading the reports. You read the reports on Jiang Zemin in, CNN, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, certainly, Guardian, and so on. And it's remarkable how well they mesh. It's almost as if, you think these people must have had a big Zoom discussion before they produced all this material. But then I'm reminded, Gore Vidal, the famous American writer, said in 1995 in an interview with the New York Times, when somebody asked about media conspiracy and the rest of it, he said, I paraphrase, he said, look, I've met these people. There is no need for a conspiracy. They all think the same way. Right. And so, this is a really powerful, it's very skillful, articulate setup. And China has to put its story forward in what is a second language too. It's the people who can understand what's being said about China in Chinese, 1.4 billion in China, but outside of that, it's still a very small number. So it's difficult. I think what we need to do, keep doing what we're doing, and you stick to telling a steady, and as far as you're able to, coherent and truthful story about what's going on to try and provide some balance. That's what I plan to keep doing anyhow.
I believe that's all the time we have. Professor Cullen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you the same time next week. Goodbye.